They're live.
Welcome, everyone. Oh, Father Innocent, we hear from you first.
Okay, good. So let us begin with the word of prayer. And we are going to take the prayer for immigrants from Pope Francis. Merciful God, we pray to you for all the men, women, and children who have died after leaving their homelands in search of a better life. Though many of their graves bear no name, to you each one is known, loved, and cherished. May we never forget them, but honor their sacrifice with deeds more than words. We entrust to you all those who have made this journey, enduring fear, uncertainty, and humiliation in order to reach a place of safety and hope. Just as you never abandoned your son as he was brought to a safe place by Mary and Joseph, so now be close to these, your sons and daughters, through our tenderness and protection. In caring for them, may we seek a world where none are forced to leave their home and where all can live in freedom, dignity, and peace. Merciful God and Father of all, wake us from the slumber of indifference, open our eyes to their suffering, and free us from the insensitivity born of worldly comfort and self-centeredness. Inspire us as nations, communities, and individuals to see that those who come to our shores are our brothers and sisters. May we share with them the blessings we have received from your hand and recognize that together, as one human family, we are all migrants, journeying in hope to you, our true home, where every tear will be wiped away, where we will be at peace and safe in your embrace. Prayer from Pope Francis for the migrants. So now I'd like to invite Dr. Gerald Grudsen from Global Ministries University, who's working in partnership with the Tangaza University, Harmony Institute, Hekima University College, and our brothers from Malawi and Uganda who were also part of this program. As I remind you, this is our closing ceremony of these 2 days of reflection, interaction on the theme, migrants, displaced people, refugees, and global solidarity. Welcome, Dr. Gerald.
Thank you, Father Innocent. I'd like to introduce Father Daniel Grudy of Notre Dame University. He's an associate provost there and professor of theology. He's very well known for his book, Theology of Migration, Bodies of Refugees and Body of Christ, which has an introduction, incidentally, by Pope Francis. This book is a wonderful story of the role that immigration has played around the world and the connection to theology. So Father Grudy has presented us an illuminating story of the connection between Christian theology, particularly theology of the body of Christ, and the bodies of refugees around the world. So we're very pleased to introduce him, and he's going to speak to us about this theme of the conference of the refugees, displaced people, and the role of theology in understanding how we should treat the refugees of the world. I now introduce Father Daniel Grudy. Thank you, Father Grudy.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Grutson, and greetings, everybody, for wherever you are around the world. And I'm delighted to just have a few minutes to share with you today, just some reflections on my own experience of working with migrants and refugees, as well as just reflecting on this in the light of Christian faith. This issue found me more than I found it, but it really was born out of my own search to understand who God is and in my own pastoral ministry, but also in my context of that pastoral ministry, really coming to understand the stories, the sufferings, the hopes, the dreams of migrants and across different borders around the world. And when I worked with them and we journeyed together, I was very moved by their plight. And so I think the central question of my work has always been, how do we think about God from the context of the migrants and refugee struggle? And even more to the point, how do they think about God? So I'm sharing with you just some thoughts that really are born out of probably 4 decades of reflection, and ultimately what kind of came to bear fruit in this work called The Theology of Migration, which Dr. Rootson talked about. So you can all help me, all the conference organizers. I'm going to try to just share a slide deck with you, and hopefully this will work. But it will just give you somewhat of a perspective on some of the things that we'll talk about and share about today. So this picture on the right, you can see it's on the cover of the book. It's actually kind of framed. There are two stories really that frame this presentation. One is a story of this mass every year around on the border between Mexico and the United States. And so if you're Catholic, you'll see sort of the structure of the Eucharist in this presentation. If you're not Catholic or you're not even Christian, hopefully you'll still see connections to your own religious denomination or tradition, because this cuts across all really theology lines and denominational lines and religious lines, because it gets to the heart of our humanity. But this is a picture here on the right of the two hands meeting each other at the sign of peace during the Eucharistic service. So in this Eucharistic service, half the communities in Mexico, half the communities in the United States, and at the border, the two hands are stretching from the American side to the Mexican side. And so I always thought this was a great symbol, I think, of what a theology of migration is trying to connect, and that there's really trying to find these bonds of human solidarity across these political divisions. But up on the left, and I'll say more about this, you'll see Pope Francis holding a chalice in his hands. And that's a chalice that he used in Lampedusa, which was the first place he visited after he was made Pope. And he visited it because he heard of a shipwreck that happened there. And in the midst of these migrants who died, he came to really remember their lives. I'll say more about this story in a moment. But he basically used a chalice made from the driftwood of a refugee boat as he remembered these people. And so the question was, what does it mean to celebrate the Eucharist with a chalice made from the driftwood of a refugee boat? So it's out of these two stories, both at, if you will, along the Mexican border, this binational mass that they have each year, and at the European and African borders, if you will, Pope Francis's mass in Lampedusa. In between all of these are many stories of migrants. And the question is, how do we connect those stories with the scriptures, and how do we connect those stories with our lives as we journey together in faith? So it's interesting that, come back a little bit. In the year 2000, there was a press conference on the White House front lawn, and Francis Collins was one of the lead scientists of the Human Genome Project. And he had announced that they had deciphered the DNA sequence, and that this was an amazing map of humankind. And if you will, the DNA sequence, if you were to put it in kind of tangible forms, if you were to put a stack of paper as high as the Washington Monument in 12-point font, you get somewhat of a sense of the dimensions of what the characters on the DNA strand look like. But by taking certain characters in that strand and by comparing them with indigenous communities around the world, you can actually, from a sample in your mouth, you can actually trace back your migration heritage 80,000 years. And this is actually an example of the journey of my ancestors over the last 80,000 years. Obviously, there's a lot in common in the root ancestry, which I know some of you are calling in from Africa. But it's believed that humanity, as we know it, probably originated near the Olduvai Gorge, today, Tanzania, in Africa, and and here of Ethiopia, Eritrea, in this area, and they would have migrated their way through different kind of calamities, wars, scarcities, environmental changes. They would have moved and they would have migrated. So my ancestors migrated their way through the Middle East into Asia, and then they arced their way back to northern Italy, southern Spain, and England. And so this is the deep ancestry of my ancestors. And it's plausible that they then would have gone from England to Ireland and then from Ireland to the United States, which is the more recent ancestry. But the point here is that even science is telling us that migration is literally in our genes. So this, even all the political rhetoric, Trump and everything else that's going on, this is not even a blip on the radar of humanity, that this thing has been going on since the beginning of time. And so this issue of migration cuts deep to the core of our humanity. It's so much a part of it that it's really in our biological genes. But it's also in our spiritual genes. If we look at the scriptures from the Old Testament to the New Testament, really the first migrants were those who were forced migrants out of Eden, if you will. But then if you look at sort of the 12th chapter of the book of Genesis, it's there that the spotlight really comes down on one person, Abraham. And on Abraham, he actually is given sort of a call to migrate from the very beginning of the narrative. Leave your country, go to the land that I will show you, and you will be a blessing. And so he actually begins in Ur, and then he migrates his way. You can see these contemporary borders here. Migrates his way through the Tigris and Euphrates, down into Haram, and then down through what is today Lebanon and Israel, Palestine, into Egypt, and then back again. So from Abraham to Exodus to exile to return, from the prophets to the disciples, we really begin to see that migration is beginning to go through the scriptures in very concrete ways. But the core of a theology of migration would also say that Jesus himself was a migrant. He was a refugee, but he also migrated from his homeland, if you will, in God's kingdom into our world and our broken and sinful existence. And there he died on the cross to help us migrate back to our homeland. So I'll explain more about that in a moment, because it is the core of a theology of migration, that Jesus not only became a refugee, but he actually has called us into migrate as well. So this story extends through the life of the disciples, the early church, and going to the ends of the earth. So much so that in the book of Revelation, at the very end, we see that John from the island of Patmos sees the vision of the New Jerusalem, and then he names the church as a pilgrim people in this world. So from beginning to end, migration goes through the scriptures, and if you will, it's in our spiritual genes. But here's a picture of some of the boats crossing from the Mediterranean today. Those who begin on the African coast, they cross over the Mediterranean, trying to find their way, like many from really Latin America through the southern borders of the United States, trying to find a more dignified life, trying to find security, trying to find protection, trying to find resources in order to live a dignified life. But these boats kind of go through this area frequently. There are more deaths in this area probably than any other migrant corridor in the world. But when one of these boats crashed, and all that was left was either the bodies of the migrants, there were 8 members who survived, and they survived by clinging to a fishing net in the middle of the ocean. And when these migrants were clinging to this net, that when the fishermen saw them, instead of saving them, they actually severed their nets and cast them to die into the ocean depths. And Pope Francis heard about this shortly after he was elected, and he was so moved by the indifference to these migrants that he took the initiative of going down to the small island of Lampedusa, which is no more than a rock in the middle of the Mediterranean. It's only about 6 square miles. In the midst of this really forgotten island, he really he wanted to remember those people who really were considered nobodies to the world. And there he really wanted to identify them as somebody, and ultimately to really say that they're connected to everybody. But in the end, he celebrated a mass to really commemorate that there's some connection between these bodies and the body of Christ. And so it's in that context that he celebrated the Eucharist in Lampedusa. And you can see they used a boat. They only had 8 days to prepare for this, by the way. The Pope just basically said he was coming. And this one carpenter who set up this mass, they put a boat underneath the altar. And you can see the chalice there, which he used. And so and then this kind of, sometimes the mass at the U.S. borders is named an American Lampedusa. So this is actually the bishops of the United States and Mexico being in a binational mass. So half the community is in Mexico, half the community is in the United States. And they celebrate one Eucharist in the midst of this divided political reality. So the core of this presentation really is to bring out one central area, one central theme, which is that if really the dominant political narrative is moving us from our oneness as a human family, which God created, to otherness, and constantly saying that the migrant is other and different, the Eucharistic narrative is going in the opposite direction. It's actually trying to bring us together in union, and to try to overcome our fragmentation, our division, and our alienation. In technical theological terms, that means that God's trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. He's trying to basically move us from our divisions to really a place of communion. So at the heart of a theology of migration is a vision of communion, and saying that what humanity is really struggling with is our divisions, our alienations, our disconnections, our loneliness, our brokenness. The Eucharist is really constantly calling us back to God and to migrate in such a way that we become more united. And really the measure of our, our closeness to God really is revealed in the measure of our connection to our brothers and sisters in our journey back to our to union with God. So in the brief time I have, I just want to cover a few points. And it's structured this way. As I thought about this, what is this connection between migration and theology? I thought, well, I'm writing as a human being, as a Christian, as a Catholic, as a priest. And so it seemed more natural that in light of these experiences, I'd also frame it in light of the Eucharist. And so the Last Supper, the Mass, the meal, all of these, however we might name it in some of our traditions, is really about this remembering what Jesus did. So the Catholic Mass has four main parts. It has an introductory rite. It has the liturgy of the word, where the scriptures are read, liturgy of the Eucharist, where the sacrament is celebrated, and a communion rite, where people are sent out into mission. So in a similar way, this becomes a heuristic device to really look at this journey of communion. And so the first part of this presentation, I just want to lay out really the introductory rite, which is looking at what I would call the age of migration. The second is looking at the liturgy of words, which is namely the debated in the conceptual territory around migration. And here I want to bring out even how the perspectives of others who disagree with me or us or others, what's even right about their arguments before getting into a critique of them. The third is then to move from really a social description of migration to really a more theological interpretation of that reality, and to look at the liturgy of Lampedusa and to name some of this theological territory. And the last part is to really talk about what this means for mission. So ultimately, underneath this theology of communion is a vision of mission in the world. And I know so many of you who are listening to this presentation are involved in that mission. And so hopefully this gives somewhat of a framing to deepen or reflect upon not only what you do, but why you do it and why it's so important. Because ultimately it is connected to our faith, and it is connected to really being called by the Lord to really be life-giving agents of love in the world. So the first part, this introductory rite, really is to just summarize. You might have done this in some of the other presentations, but it's just to say that there are more migrants than ever before. As I said, this is not a new issue, but what is new is the scale and the numbers. There's 281 million migrants in the world, which means that 1 out of every 28 people in the world is a migrant. There are more than 100 million refugees at present, which is more than World War II. And even since I've been working in this issue, it's staggering how this has multiplied, over the last number of decades. To put it in another way, if refugees were settled in one particular place, they'd be the 21st largest country in the world, and they would be growing at 38,000 people a day, or 24 people a minute. Counting those who are moving within countries, namely those who are internally displaced and not crossing international borders, there'd be as many as 1 billion migrants, which is 1 out of every 7 people in the world. Now, as we add to this climate change, the anticipation that hundreds of millions of people will be displaced in the coming decades for issues related to climate change, this number could extend even higher. So this issue is not going away, and it is going to be with us, and it is going to be one of the defining, if not the defining issue of our times. But behind all these numbers is our human faces. And I know, working with our Bishops' Conference for about a dozen years, I was on the Bishops' Conference Committee on Migration and Refugees. We would often go to areas of concern where there was a lot of human displacement. And some of those in more recent years, obviously, has been in the Middle East. Look at this Iraqi outflows, the Syrian refugees, not to mention all the other kind of displacements going on in that region. What was first the biblical land of Abraham still is one of the epicenters of migration today. But this was the picture of a woman who just fled over the Syrian border. 3 of her 4 sons have been killed. Her 4th grandson, and she just got news that it put in prison. These are some of her widowed daughters-in-law that are there. They're living in the fields. But it's amazing, sort of this human face of the migrant, which is really at the core of a theology of migration, because she was not just a number or statistics. And when I saw this, when I encountered this moment, it felt like I was encountering a living pieta, that this was really this woman literally holding her son, if not only in sacred memory, in her hands. And she's obviously a Muslim. And interestingly enough, the woman next to her, you can see she's standing by her in solidarity, but there are no words that can touch it. I mean, there's no words that can actually really begin to name her grief. And these moments, I think, which so many of us, I think, who are here today have encountered, is really kind of stepping into this mystery of human suffering and agony, which so much of our faith presents to us through our own lives, but especially in the lives, in this case, of those who are suffering like migrants and refugees. So keeping this human face, the human face of the migrant, is at the core of a theology of migration. It begins with a description of a social reality, but at some point we have to come back to the fact that these are people. They're not just, if these are not human beings made in God's image and likeness, then this is a whole other equation. But if these are human beings, this makes a whole set of different moral demands on us. So this, at the end, is really saying that we live in a time which are really is the age of migration. But how do people think about it? And this is why, I spent decades kind of reflecting on this and with different constituencies. And some of the kind of more interesting ones were when I was working with the Border Patrol agents in different countries and really trying to understand who they are. And as in the process of doing this, just to give one example, I was working with the Border Patrol agents in the southern border of the United States, and I'd gone in search and rescue runs, helicopter patrols, but in this case, I was on a ride along with them. And one agent I was with, he was describing to me what he was doing on a daily basis. But one time we were at the Mexican border, we were kind of driving along in this Ford Bronco truck, and he said to me, one time I was here and there were these aliens who came across, these were his words, and he said, I went in pursuit of them. And then he said, unbeknownst to me, they had weapons and they were smuggling drugs, which it's, 98% of the world of the people are hardworking people looking for a job, but these were criminal elements at this moment. So he said, they turned around and started raining machine gun fire down upon me. And he said, I hit the deck. And he says, I heard all these bullets going over my head. And he says, I thought I was going to die at that moment. And he said it was so traumatic that he had to go to counseling. He had work through stuff with nightmares and everything. And so suddenly this Border Patrol agent became very human to me. And then I realized that, he was also trying to do a job and trying to really live, his own life with dignity. But in the context of this, I was getting into his mindset. And then I realized that this is a complex issue. But as we went further along, I asked him, I said, how do you know which people to stop? And he said, well, usually you look for these things. And it was no more than 2 minutes after I asked the question, a suspicious car went by. He flipped on his lights. And then I saw these migrants just running in every direction. And I was so much into the mind of this Border Patrol agent that my first reaction was, oh, I hope he gets them. But then I had a flashback and I thought about all the migrants I've worked with over the years. And I thought, oh my gosh, no, I hope they run. I hope they get away. And I'm like, go, And it was at that moment I said, wow, this is very complex. And then as all this stuff was going on, I began to say, it's important to kind of register all these different perspectives before we begin to say what our opinion is on this. So I'm going to give you, there's more to say on that, but I want to do is give you an overview of research that I did with Border Patrol agents, vigilante groups, political leaders, hospital administrators in emergency rooms, corporations, human rights activists, lawyers, and a number of other folks, and then kind of grid this a couple different ways. So I'll go through this rather quickly, but it's just to give you somewhat of a landscape of this kind of debated territory. There are vigilante groups that really are trying to really protect the borders where federal enforcement fails. Is the Department of Homeland Security and ICE, which is trying to really enforce the policy that's been given them by political leaders. And this shifted a lot, obviously, after 9/11, which seems like a while ago now, but having worked with the Border Patrol prior to 9/11, there was a big shift once those planes hit the World Trade Center. Suddenly, instead of migrants, they became terrorists. That was the fear. Political leaders, their desire is to, and their task is to create federal policy. And that's changed a lot over the years in the United States. In the beginning, we have been always an immigrant country, but the policy was we actually accept almost everyone, but we do make some exceptions to keep some people out. Now we accept almost no one, but we make some exceptions. So this policy changes over time, and it's changed a lot. But there's always been, and I'm speaking from the United States, knowing that there are other countries here. But I've seen this in other countries as well. There has been sometimes an openness to immigrants, but there's also been a deep anti-immigrant sentiment as well. Corporations are also trying to open the borders so that they can have talented labor or cheap labor. Church leaders are really trying to sort of constantly say that human beings are made in God's image and likeness, and that the task of the church is to denounce injustice, to announce the reign of God, and to build a civilization of love. And then lastly, human rights advocates drawing from different traditions are also trying to protect the exploitation of the vulnerable, to fight for human dignity. So those are generally the best reads on what people are trying to do in some of this space. And this is both transnational and transhistorical. I've seen this, across generations and also in different countries I've worked in. That generally speaking, with some variation, this is what some of the protagonists are in the immigration drama. But it's not just about being right and wrong in this point. Sometimes it's actually trying to look at what's right. And in other words, what are the rights being addressed here? So in this case, this group is often fighting for property rights. This group is often fighting for sovereign rights, or the right to control a border. This group is often looking at cultural rights and trying to figure out what the identity of a nation's about. This group is looking at economic rights. This group is looking at natural rights given by God. And this group is looking at human rights, classically defined. So the question is not between right and wrong, but then how do these rights begin to really interface with each other? And how do you begin to prioritize these? This is where there's a deeper level of reflection needed. And this is where a theology of migration begins to sort of express, begins to sort of hint towards a need for some deeper reflection, of which theology speaks to later. But before getting into that, I want to begin to say a bit more about the political positions. This group is basically trying to close down the borders and keep migrants out. This group is saying they need work, we need workers, let's create a system where people can move back and forth. This group is saying they need the work, we need the workers, let's create a legal system so people can move back and forth. And the Catholic Church's position is not to have completely open borders. It says there's a value to borders, but it's not an absolute right. And that even the needs of a nation need to be subjected to kind of a larger international common good. But here's where it begins to shift. And here's really where there are deep ethical dimensions underneath it, which is the narratives that begin to be created. And that narrative begins to be shaped by the words we use about migration. Language shapes a reality. And in this case, language shapes a narrative. This group sees them as aliens. In my first book on migration, I actually wanted to call it alien spirituality. And I thought I could get Sigourney Weaver to do the introduction to this book. But I honestly, the question is, what is the narrative when we say these people are aliens? When a person crosses a border, do they have no rights because they shouldn't have crossed the border legally? Or do they have intrinsic rights because they're given by God? I mean, this is really where kind of the issues begin to kind of emerge more dramatically. This group sees them as workers, and really the economists today would put it at parity. For every argument that says they take and they drain, there are also arguments that say they give back and also do work that no one else wants to do. But the rhetoric and the narrative that really are at stake here shape a lot of the positions. And if those narratives are not aligned with reality, that's really where the injustices happened. This group here sees them as people. This is not a terribly deep thought, but this is probably the most important, because if we do not see them as people, then this is a entirely different ethical equation. But if they are people, it roots it in a very different set of ethical demands. So the human face of the migrant, coming back to that, is extremely important. But here's also where it gets complicated. I find this even with very educated people. Probably one of the most common pushback questions I get is, Father, which part of illegal don't you understand? These people cross the border, they shouldn't be here. What don't you get? And really the issue is, to me, which part of legal don't you understand? And this is where theology begins to really demonstrate a sort of tangible way of understanding this. Thomas Aquinas said there's actually four kinds of laws. There's natural laws. In this case, people need to feed their families, which is why many migrate. There's civil laws, of which what's a nation set up, community set up in order to organize and order the common good. The third is there are divine laws, which we know through Scripture, about feeding the hungry and the thirsty and the naked and so on. But there are eternal laws through which God keeps the universe in motion, which we don't have access to, but we know that God somehow orders. Justice happens when those laws are aligned. Injustice happens when there's variance between them. So Martin Luther King from a Birmingham jail could say that any law which segregates is actually not aligned with divine laws and human and other eternal laws. But this is where it gets complicated, is that this group is going to emphasize the civil laws. And it's an appeal to what I would call the invisible mind, which is, what are you, crazy? If we let these people in, they're going to ruin our culture. They're going to kind of steal everything we have. They're going to keep us from being who we are. And so it's sort of seen as being a totally unreasonable proposition. This group sees that it's really, why don't we let the economic laws work this out? And there's an appeal to the invisible hand, which Adam Smith talked about, but even our understanding today is probably very different and far from what Adam Smith imagined. Because when the economic laws alone work them out, we often fall prey to idols, one of which is money theism, that we let money alone guide us, which there are human costs in its wake. The third group are the natural laws, and this is an appeal to even what the United Nations has named the invisible heart. So this really becomes a question of where we begin to root our positions around this. And in the midst of this, there really is, I think, one sort of central question that comes up, and that is, who is the other? What is my relationship to the other? And if the long view of life is moving from our otherness to oneness, this is where the deeper migration needs to happen. So the first calculus of this first group is really about the fear of the other. The second is about the usefulness of the other. And the third is about the connection to the other. So this is where some of this becomes not just a socio-political issue, but actually becomes something deeply spiritual, deeply ethical, and deeply human. So let me summarize this second part by just saying this is not then about just migrating across political borders. And there's a political fundamentalism about this issue. This is a deeply human issue. But it's often really trying to deal with this tension between human rights and sovereign rights, between civil law and natural law, between national security and human insecurity. And here I want to take a decided shift from social description and analysis to more now a theological interpretation. So it's moving from citizenship to discipleship. And that is to say that if there is a value in being a member of a state and feeling the expectations of fulfilling that membership, what though does it mean if we profess faith in Christ, or more broadly, if we believe in God, to respond to the inclusive demands of religion or the ethical demands of the gospel? So that takes us into a more theological interpretation. And with this, I want to just sort of share with you a story that happened to me when I was doing some research on the borders of Morocco. So this is really folks coming out of sub-Saharan Africa. They were hiding out in the mountains. They were coming from different countries, Somalia, Sudan, and Uganda. And I was up in the mountains listening to the story of these migrants. And at one point, at 3 days into our conversations with each other in these back corridors of Ceuta and Melilla, so we're on this small little Spanish colonies on the African coast. So I'm actually in the African continent, but actually in these small colonies in Ceuta. And at one point, the tables turned and they said, what do you do? And they knew I was a priest, and they actually, knew I was from the United States. But then they said, well, kind of, what else do you do? And so at that point, I became a little nervous, honestly, and sheepish, because I thought, well, actually, I said, well, I teach some things on theology and migration. And it was like I was in front of this very, if you will, authoritative jury of people who lived through this experience. And so the question was, do these ideas hold up to their experience or not? But one of these guys, his name was Emmanuel, was kind of scratching his head, and he says, well, theology of migration. He said, he looked at me and he says, some people say the reason why we're suffering so much here in Africa is because we're descendants of Judas. And because what Judas did to Jesus, we're paying the consequences. He said, what do you think of that? So that was a theology of migration, that somehow they were being punished. It was bad theology, but I said to him, I said, Emmanuel, here's a whole other way of thinking about this. And here's really the central message of the talk. I said to him, God so loved the world in the person of Jesus Christ that he migrated into the far and distant territory of our sinful and broken existence. And there he died on a cross to reconcile us to God so that we can migrate back to our homeland. So what God is doing in Jesus is constantly trying to break down those walls and barriers that are keeping us from being in communion. And the first, really foundation of that is really the image of God. And no matter how many stories I've had with migrants, no matter where the places were, when I ask, if you were speaking in my shoes today or speaking on a pulpit, what would you say? And they'd often say, we're tired of being treated. One said, look, I've stood away on baggage compartments of buses. I've crossed mountains and almost frozen to death. I've gone through train cars and almost suffocated to death. I've gone through deserts, almost baked to death. He says that stuff is hard, but the worst part is when people treat you like you're a dog, like you're no one to anyone, like you're not even a human being. He says all we want to be is human. So the first is you have this undeconstructible reality of being made in God's image and likeness, and what cries out from the migrant is this desire just to be human. The second is really the word of God, which is passing over the divine-human divide. And it's interesting, when this great migration happened of God entering into, if you will, the territory of our human life, Mary was betrothed to Joseph. And technically, to have somebody who's not your betrothed or spouse, to have a child through someone else, in this case, God, was an illegal act. And if you can contemplate this for a moment, that Jesus came into the world as an illegal alien. He was illegal because he really was born out of wedlock, but he was an alien because he did come from another world. And so you ask, why would God choose to save the world through an illegal alien? Except for the fact that it would put God's mercy outside the bounds of any human conception and open up a way of hope for everyone, including all those who are left outside the law, like sinners, tax collectors, migrants, and aliens like us. But it also names that we are all aliens, if you will, because of sin. But in this sense, it heightens the message of what the theology of migration is all about. Thirdly, it brings us to a principle of a theology of migration, which is about the mission of God, which is passing over the human-human divide. And my good friend, the late Father Virgil Elizondo, used to say that when Jesus came, he came to proclaim God's kingdom. The symbol of that kingdom was the table. And Jesus did his ministry around tables. He spent most of his time at meals with people, but he invited people to the table who had been excluded: the sinner, the tax collector, the prostitute, the Gentile. And so his mission was to welcome to the table those who had been excluded to table, because he knew this thing of rejection. By welcoming people, he rejected rejection. But in rejecting rejection, there were others at that table who said, these people don't belong here, so they rejected Jesus. But what Elizondo says is that the reject who rejected rejection is also the one who rises from the dead, which vindicates Jesus's way as God's way. And so in all circumstances, what God is calling us through this message is to continue to break down those walls that divide one person, one human being from another, so that we can really find communion at the same table together. What that actually leads us to is, and I'll just wrap up with these final thoughts here, is ultimately a vision of God. And if my vision of life is, these are my things, this is my nation, this is my stuff, I've earned it, it's mine, and I have to protect it and keep it, that's a very different way of rooting oneself in the world than saying everything I have is a gift. Nothing I own in a final way. When I die, I'm going to have to give it up, and I'll be judged by how I use what I've been given. That's a very different vision of who I am before God. And that's about crossing over the country kingdom divide. And one of the things I love to do is I love to watch the Olympics. And I have to confess that during the Summer Olympics and the Winter Olympics. I love watching the gold medal count every day, and I want to make sure that we're beating China in the summertime or Russia in the wintertime, whatever that may be. But then in the end, when I see, the Russian skater go like this, or when I see, some other person from another nation also bless themselves, I say, there's an identity way beyond who I am as an American that unites me to this person beyond those political divides. And so what Jesus is ultimately asking us, I think, to do is to not limit or short circuit our identity by our nation states, but saying there's a larger kingdom that unites us, and in which case, as Pope Francis says, we're called to build bridges. So ultimately, that leads us to really crossing over the life-death divide, which is saying that this life-death divide is not just happens when we stop breathing, but also how we make choices in favor of everything that leads us closer to communion with each other. So these are some of the images of Pope Francis from Lampedusa. But in the end, when you have Mass at the border, you really begin to say that the Eucharist gives expression to the beginnings of our communion with each other. So what I've tried to say in this talk today is to really give some sense of the global refugee crisis, to talk about Pope Francis's I think, words about a globalization of indifference, which happened to these refugees in Lampedusa, but also speak about what John Paul II said in terms of a globalization of solidarity. So if the journey of many migrants today is a journey of nobodies to the world, who sees them as nobody, they're nobody to anybody in some ways, they often give expression to a desire to become somebody. But in the end, I think a theology says they are connected to everybody, but in the end, they are very much interrelated to the body of Christ in ways that what's happening inside the church in the celebration of the Eucharist is also connected of how Christ is truly present in those who are hungry, thirsty, naked, sick, imprisoned, estranged, as you will, in the outside world. So what that requires then is not just more information about migration, but a new imagination. And if the Department of Homeland Security frames much of the policies in the United States, perhaps what we need is a new narrative around migration. And less in saying who the other is, but one that is rooted more fundamentally in looking at the root causes of migration. In this case, it deals with development and really helping people stay in their homelands. But while we work at that, we can also really see that the hallmark of a person of faith is revealed through hospitality. But all of this is, I think, rooted in our call to human solidarity. So there's more I can say, but I'm going to end it there because I want to just leave some time for questions. But it's a first word, I guess, on how we begin to think theologically in ways that nourish our ministries to those who are most vulnerable in the world today.
Thank you very much, Father Grudy. This was an illuminating talk, and we open it now to any questions. I'll start one with my own question. Given the politics of our own country right now, is there any strategy you have for trying to change the narrative? And that you presented a narrative, a theological narrative. And it seems that our Christian churches have a responsibility to foster this kind of narrative. Is there any coordinated effort by the churches to develop this narrative together? In other words, it's wonderful that Pope Francis has put it out there, but it seems to be, since a large part of our Christian population is Protestant, has there been any attempt to unite Catholic and Protestant views on migration that you're aware of?
Yeah, I mean, there are many, and I think there are many faith-based groups that have taken up this task. I mean, certainly, as I mentioned, working with the bishops for many decades now on this issue, it's astounding the work that's being done in terms of direct service through Catholic Charities and other services, political advocacy, but also education on this. I think some people wish they could hear it more from the pulpits, but I think we have to be very mindful, I think, of the narratives that are being promulgated in the media.
Right.
And that's why this narrative flies straight in the face, I think, those narratives. But I have to say that neither Democrat nor Republicans in this country have really had a life-giving vision of this. Obama was really seen as the porter in chief. And certainly Trump has used this as one of his strategies to create fear and also to kind of really kind of identify the other. in his case, in ways that mobilizes people. So I think it's therefore incumbent upon, communities of faith to say there are different ways of thinking about this and there are different narratives. But I think what's even at stake beyond that is saying, what's the bigger picture of our lives, and holding before people that it's not about economic efficiencies or utilitarianism or political gain. It's about our humanity, which is at stake. And if we actually can't see ourselves in the neighbor who's so vulnerable, then we run the risk of deporting our hearts. So I think that's really where I think it's so important to say this is not just a matter of a literary kind of project to sort of make sure we have kind of good narratives. Our humanity is at stake.
Father,
Let me
great.
just give just a personal experience, because this topic touches me, coming from the eastern part of Congo, at the border with Uganda. My parents fled from Congo, refugees in Uganda, and were settled in Seattle, Washington State, and were welcomed by the parishioners. Actually, there's one who sponsored them and helped them to integrate into society. And I know that's quite a number of faith-based groups are really trying to give a human face to these people who flee their countries and seeking for a better life. Yeah. So the role of the church is really, and faith-based organizations is key for the counter narrative of what political leaders try to put up there, closing the walls, while the churches and I imagine also mosques are opening up for migrants and refugees to give them a better life, dignified life.
That's right, Maganya. And I know some people in this country say that the reason why the church is interested in migration is so it can fill the pews. But it really is just such a reductive reading of that. I mean, the reason why the church is committed to this is because it sees its mission in light of Jesus. And it says that if this is how Jesus really came into the world and also how he called his disciples to live, it's incumbent upon us to live in a way that allows human beings to flourish. And human dignity is really at the heart of this issue. And it's at the heart of the church. I mean, if you go to the National Shrine in Washington, D.C., it's made up of a lot of smaller, side chapels that are donated by the immigrant communities in the United States. And so you see that, immigrants are us. I mean, that in some sense, we're, as a nation, we're not unique around the world in this, but I think our nation in particular is shaped by the immigrant experience. But at the same time, been a welcoming place to immigrants, and it's been an incredibly dehumanizing and discriminating place with migrants. That continues.
We have a question online. My question is the following. Would you agree that the politics of today is fueled by an extreme form of apartheid? Does that, in your analysis, allow strong forms of resistance and rejection?
Yeah, whether you call it apartheid, racism, nativism, political exclusion, it's all driven by the same root narrative, which is a fear of the other. And that's why I think that how this gets segregated and divided, all of that are symptoms of this deeper alienation, brokenness, fragmentation that's part of the human condition. So this highlights even more why theology is necessary. And in some sense, we are theologizing even if we're not conscious of it. I mean, to make the nation state our God, money our God, and to really have policies that flow out of that. There's a operative theology at work, even if we don't call it that. So it's not if we believe in God or not, it's what God we believe in. The task of the faith community is constantly purify and reflect on our understandings of God so that we don't make false gods. So the real dangers for Israel was never atheism, not believing in God. It's really idolatry. It's making false gods. But in this case, in our brokenness, we actually work that out in many kinds of unhelpful and unhealthy ways. So apartheid is one way of doing it. That's a form of racism, but nativism as well. I mean, what we did to the Native Americans in this country was equally exclusionary. What we did to the Chinese with the Chinese Exclusionary Act. it's a deep pattern in human experience of constantly sort of rejecting the other. But I think, again, here to introduce a theological notion, because this easily can get kind of locked into just political analyses and policies. But the deep theological question here is our journey with God moving more to what is called the reign of likeness to God? In other words, we're moving more towards communion, or the reign of unlikeness to God, where we're actually becoming more divided and alienated, even from our own humanity. So if we can't see really the humanity of those who suffer, who come to us, then frankly, we have a bigger problem than migration. There's a more fundamental kind of alienation within us that's disconnected us even from our humanity.
Father Grudy, this is Marita Brutson. I'm happy to see that you are provost of the undergraduates, and I trust that you have a fair amount of interaction with the undergraduates. And I'm wondering about the youth that you have contact with, how how that dialogue goes, whether it's in the classroom or in the lecture hall or in the hallway. Do you see students recognizing, yes, it's our humanity, or whatever? What is your experience as provost and professor?
I teach in theology and global affairs, so my work kind of straddles this issue of kind of Christian spirituality and also social dimensions of dimensions of social justice. And I teach a course called The Heart's Desire and Social Change, which tries to actually explore with students the connection between the deepest desires of their heart, spirituality, and the needs and challenges of the world, social justice. And, this is such a wonderful space to meet students because they're hungry. It's such an exceptional group of students to work with, but they're searching, they're confused, they're disoriented. They're have a growing realization that, hey, what the world is telling me success is all about, my life is saying that my heart wants more. And in that, they're kind of trying to, we move them through this kind of process of self-awareness, self-development, and self-gift that says, hey, the long arc of my life is about sort of moving towards giving my life away in service. That's built into us. It's wired into us. But it can't just be head knowledge. It's got to be something that they've kind of lived into. So the real challenge of education is not just filling their minds with stuff, but actually drawing out from them what their deepest longings are, and then trying to make connections from that to what I think the gospel is orienting them to, of mission, of vision, of humanity, of flourishing, of connection, of communion. So there's a lot there, Marita, and but I just find it's great to work with this group of students, and the task is trying to work with them where they're at, but trying to orient them towards a bigger vision of their lives.
Thank you.
One other question I have is, we mentioned about developing coalitions. I was impressed by the work of the Carter Center for many years on human rights around the world. And there are these different groups. You mentioned, you have different human rights groups, different theological groups. It seems that the challenge of our time is forming coalitions to counter. There's two basic narratives, the one that you've presented and the one which is common now in our present policies to restrict immigration. So I guess the challenge for us is, how do we build stronger coalitions that will allow this image that you've presented to emerge? I don't know, are there any coalitions that you're aware of that bring all these groups together?
I think you identify, just that community building and that moving towards communion is really rooted in building communities
Right.
that can really form another way of living and being in the world. And I think that is really the Christian vision of a resistance, that in some sense we don't have to adopt the tactics of empire, but we can live in the world in a different way. And that Jesus holds out a way that these more dehumanizing exclusionary politics is not the way of God. But I think there are many different ways in which that's happening, from a political perspective to a faith perspective. I'm most interested in the faith dimensions of these parts, but there are political implications to those faith dimensions. So I think, yes, I think there are these places. And at the end of my theology of migration book, I try to highlight, 5 or 6 groups around the world that are really trying to embody these different ways of living and being in the world, that are doing the works of mercy, not just personally, but collectively, of feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, burying the dead, giving drink to the thirsty, visiting those in prison. So it's those kinds of coalitions that I've primarily been focused on.
We have
2 questions from online, or 3 questions. One is from Uganda by Rogers Mwansa, who works in the Vicariate for Refugees at the border between Uganda and Sudan, and is asking, in your analysis, what is the place of human solidarity in the context of protectionist policies? For example, Uganda is proud to be a champion of open door policy on the continent of Africa. However, it seems to play a protectionist policy in the labor market as well as the naturalization process. What do you say about that?
Yeah, I think you name well, I think, these tensions. This is a very hard issue to be a politician and to take a stand that really seeks to offer a human hand to migrants, is one that opens up great criticism. And Uganda has really been, one of the ones that in the midst of a lot of humanitarian crises has really opened its doors. But it also has a flip side that makes people very much a target, for anti-immigrant sentiment. And the hard part is that even the narratives that are also assessed against the migrants, in this case, the migrants are our problem, often aren't rooted in reality. You can always find a one-off on this, but this is where it becomes such an important thing to fight against, because the facts about the narratives themselves aren't always aligned with the facts of what's actually happening. So, again,
there is also another question from Nigeria. How do the ethical imperatives highlighted in Fratelli Tutti intersect with human rights frameworks when addressing the needs of displaced populations?
Yeah, I think they intersect kind of very deeply. The only difference is that, Fratelli Tutti is coming out of a theological framing of the rights of the human person, whereas, traditional human rights is coming more of a philosophical perspective. But that's why earlier in the presentation, I said there is an intersection of those and a lot of common ground. And a lot of work that can be done in the future, and trying to say what Pope Francis is saying in Fratelli Tutti is also connected to the international, kind of guidelines on human rights.
Maybe a last question online is from Lawrence. He says, thank you so much for your presentation. Can the roots of forced migration be dealt with at a more global level?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I would just say this, that migration is not the problem. Migration is the symptom of a deeper problem and deeper human imbalances. Just to give one example of that, in some of my other work, I worked with the World Bank and trying to kind of get clarity on these statistics. But 19% of the world lives on less than $1 a day. 48% of the world lives on less than $2 a day. 75% of the world lives on less than $10 a day. 95% of the world lives on less than $50 a day. The top 1% of the world has as much as the poorest 57% of the world, and the 3 richest people in the world have as much as the poorest 48 nations. What that means is that when you have that kind of imbalance, where so few have so much and so many have so little, there's no often option, if you're going to live a dignified life, than to move to find better opportunities. And that's why the global north is really what is drawing people from the global south. But here's the twist. The greatest burden sharing and providing for refugees is not done by the global north. It's actually done by developing countries. So in this sense, unless we look at the root causes of migration, people can't stay in their homelands because they don't have jobs. The rule of law is not protecting them because of cartels or other things. That there are kind of systems of exploitation and oppression and poverty and political collapse that keep people from staying in their homelands. Unless we address those problems, people are going to be forced to move. So that's why I do think that it's not just the fact that they're moving, that's the symptom. It's addressing the root causes, which hopefully in the end, and the first teaching of Catholic social teaching is that migrants have a right to stay in their homeland. And ideally, I think that would be the solution.
So thank you very much. Back to you, Gerard, maybe to thank the Father Grudy for his presentation before we bring out some highlights on these 2 days of the conference, and then we get the view of some religious leaders and the way forward.
Thank
Back
you
to
very
you.
much, Father Grudy, for a wonderful presentation. And this recording will be listed on our Fratelli Tutti site. We hope that it can be seen by many people around the world. And we thank you for your ministry, which has been so prominent in this time of issues around migration. So thank you for your time, and thank you for this presentation.
Great. Thanks, everybody. I hope we can find new ways to be connected and work together and support each other. So great being with you.
Yeah, I'll be going to Nigeria, which is going to be coming up in our final, we need to connect people around the world. And that's part of the goal that we have, is connecting people so that we're not isolated in one part of the world. We think this is just our problem in one area of the world. But so the role of this conference and our work is to connect us with each other. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody.
And actually, we would like to continue the conversation online. So the conference will end today, but the conversation will continue, and really to bring together this global community around the issues of migration, displaced people, and refugees, so that we can sit together, now we can give them a dignified, life, and recognize the contribution that they do in their host countries. Thank you very much for this.
Thanks, Maganya. I'm going to be in Uganda in July, mid-July. So if you're around, let me know. I'd love to connect.
And then I can connect you with one of our brothers who's in the Vicariate for Refugees in the Diocese of Arua, Brother Rogers, who is actually online. I will make him in contact with you, so that at least if in Uganda, you can also see concretely what they are doing on the ground.
That would be great. I'd love that.
Okay. Thank you very much,
everybody.
Father Grudy.
God bless you all.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So, Yusuf, you can help us with the video, just a few minutes before we take on the rabbi. Is he around, the rabbi, Marita?
Yes, she is. She's right here.
Okay, fine.
She's
So
waving at us.
in between, let us now see the highlights of these 2 days of conference before we go to the rabbi. Okay. Thank you very much, Yusuf, for this wonderful message. Now, let's back to you, Gerald, to introduce the rabbi. Now, we want to see the point of view of our religious leaders. Yeah, we are now towards the end of our conference. So, please, can you introduce the rabbi?
Marita.
Yes, this is Marita Grudson, who has the honor of introducing our Rabbi Ilana Goldhaber Gordon, who is an associate rabbi here in the Bay Area of Congregation Beth Jacob. She is known for her joy, her honesty, her empathetic listening. Rabbi Ilana was ordained from the Academy of the Jewish Religion here in California, a post-denominational school with a spiritual bent. So please, Rabbi Ilana.
Thank you. I want to offer some reflections from my tradition, but actually, before I do, I want to start with a quote from a woman named Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote a lovely book called Braiding Sweetgrass. Some of you may have read it. She's from the Potawatomi Indians, the Native American tribe in the Great Lakes region. And here is what she wrote of her people. Is it okay if I screen share?
Oh, yes, of course.
Let's see if that will work.
It opens.
You should be co-host.
Opens. Huh. Oh. You're not seeing it, are you?
No, not yet.
Apologies.
Is she co-host?
Okay. Let's see if it works now. I'm sorry.
Sure, take your time.
Okay. Not gonna, are you seeing it?
Yes, we're seeing it. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right. Our people were canoe people until they made us walk, until our lakeshore lodges were signed away for shanties and dust. Our people were a circle until we were dispersed. Our people shared a language with which to thank the day until they made us forget. But we didn't forget. Not quite. What I loved about that quote is that she's not denying the enormity. In fact, throughout her book, she doesn't deny the enormity of what was lost. It's just incalculable. When a community is forced permanently from its home, it does not recover in the sense of being the same as it was. But she also notes that just the thread of identity, the thread of culture, for her, the memory of showing gratitude to the land, that was enough to cling to sustain hope. Now, my own people became refugees nearly 2,000 years ago when Roman conquerors drove us from our land. And many observers of history have wondered, how did the Jews survive for so many centuries, outcast and wandering? And at least part of the answer is we never let go of our feeling of connection. We never let go of hope. I speak to you now from the comfort of 2 generations settled and secure in the United States. All of my grandparents were either refugees or very poor immigrants, but I've not experienced those traumas myself. I know the heart of the refugee only through my grandparents' stories and through the countless implicit teachings that a parent passes down to a child. So I can only offer my words today with utter humility, as nothing but an observer with a genuine desire to help. I'm outraged and appalled that the country that gave refuge to my grandparents, The land that is now my home and my country, the United States, is slamming its doors shut to refugees in the midst of the largest refugee crisis that humanity has ever faced. There's no sugarcoating such cruel, closed-hearted behavior. And we must not let go of hope, of our knowledge that we are all connected to one another, even especially when those in power attempt to slam doors shut and divide us. For my own people, the words of the prophet sustained us through many such hard times. And I'll tell you honestly, most of those words are not comforting. The prophets witnessed the exile of their people. They were angry and hurt. And we too have to give voice to the outrage, the pain, the grieving for the lost and the broken. And piercing through the walls of torment comes also the voice of hope. So I want to do is share with you some of the most vivid verses from the prophet Isaiah, who promised a bright future for a nation of refugees. And again, I'll screen share those. I'll be more successful this time. These are from what's called the Book of Consolation. It's chapters 40 through 66. Of course, I won't be sharing all those chapters, but just excerpts that our people lift up during the time of the high holidays, during our most time of deepest introspection. And to appreciate these verses, you have to understand that he was standing there witnessing the enslavement, the exile, the slaughter of his people. And in that context, he was still able to say such things as, "The Spirit of my sovereign God is upon me because God has anointed me. I've been sent a messenger to the humble, to bandage the brokenhearted, to announce freedom to the captives, opening the gates for the imprisoned, to proclaim a year of God's desire and a day of vindication by our God, to comfort all who mourn. And they shall build the ancient ruins, raise up the desolations of old, and renew the ruined cities, the desolations of many ages. For as the earth brings forth her foliage, and as a garden makes the seed shoot up, so my sovereign God will make justice and praise blossom in the presence of all the nations." Think about that image. A seed is just like a little stone. There's no visible life in it, and you put it in the dirt, and out comes the future. Out comes green life. And so the prophet imagines that a nation of refugees will somehow be renewed. Families of refugees, families who are lost, can find new hope and new life. God has sworn with the divine right hand, with the mighty arm, "Nevermore will I give your new grain to your enemies for food, nor shall oppressors drink the new wine for which you have labored." The exploitation that we witness today, both those who plant the land and then are forced from it, and also those who are migrants in other people's lands that they're not allowed to claim for their own and do the hard labor and then are not able to enjoy the fruits of their work. Isaiah promises that this will be no more. For those who harvest it shall eat it and give praise to God, and those who gather it shall drink it in my sacred courts. And the act of praise is always woven in to the experience of salvation. And the last few, the experience of being driven from your land is this experience of shutting down, of living on the defensive, of furtive, of never knowing where you're safe. And he imagines the opposite, in which we're able to open up, throw wide our gates, welcome people through, pass through the gates, clear the road for the people, build up the highway, remove the rocks, raise a banner over the nations. We're celebrating the migrants. We're celebrating being able to be open-hearted, open-doored, allowing all in. In the next verse, Isaiah imagines the lost people as a mother bereft of children, or as a woman who is barren and unable to bear children, desiring that burst of life that a full family would give her. "Shout, O infertile one, you who bore no child. Shout aloud for joy, you who did not dance. For the children of the wife forlorn shall outnumber those of the espoused," said God. "Enlarge the site of your tent. Extend the size of your dwelling." We're welcoming everyone in. "Do not stint lengthen the ropes and drive the pegs firm. And so in the spirit of the prophet Isaiah, may we live to see the day when all humanity has a space in that enlarged tent, when we are all able to harvest enough to eat and to eat what we harvest, when we all may shout for joy for the end of a time of displacement.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Ilana, for your words of comfort and your dream and your vision that you bring from your scriptures.
Thank you for this beautiful conference.
Thank you. And so I'm turning it back to Gerald Grutson, who will introduce our next guest.
We'd like to welcome now our group in Nigeria. This is the dialogue group that we're working with in Nigeria. I'll be going to Nigeria in just a few weeks to meet with UFOC Dialogue Group. And we have Emra Ilgens here with us, coming in from Nigeria. Emra, do you want to pick up from now?
First of all, thank you so much, Mr. Grizer, and also for audience. So first of all, I would like to introduce Father Lawrence, who is from Catholic Church, Dialogue of Mission. So if possible, I would like to invite, first of all, Mr. Father Lawrence. Father Lawrence, can you hear us? I think he's not hearing us well. So,
Is it Don Renzo? Maybe he can just unmute himself.
yes, Don Rosa, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you now. I've unmuted myself now.
Okay. Please
Yes.
keep continuing.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I lost connection a bit, and I'm just coming back now.
Okay.
So he's asking, he was giving you the chance to address us, Don Renzo. Welcome.
All right, thank you very much. I want to first and foremost appreciate those who have organized this conference, and also to apologize that I came in late for the conference. But I want to really say that incidentally today for us in the Catholic world, we celebrate the feast of Saint Josephine Bakita, who herself was a victim of forced migration, if you like, from Sudan, and then moving from one hand to another from different owners, eventually ended up in Italy. So today we celebrate that great day, that lady, wonderful lady, and we use this opportunity as well to reflect on the dangers of forced migration, but also the issue of development or lack of it, so to speak, that has continued to plague our world, especially in this part of the world, Global South, that has continued to force people to move from where they are. I was very happy when the presenter earlier on responded to my question and said something about the economic disparity between the global north and the global south. But then it's not really about the north and south. I think it's about the way the economy of the world has been, if you like, rearranged to suit a few persons. But I also want to say that while we task the people who have a great opportunity to actually be making use of their wealth, we also want to solicit support from people around the world to get the governments in this part of the world, especially in Global South, for instance, in Nigeria and other sub-Saharan African countries, to become more responsive to the needs of their people, because that has continued to worsen the situation and push people into a very vulnerable situation and wanting to change places and move outside of their homelands. I don't think anybody there would ordinarily want to just move from their homelands, ancestral lands, if they are not forced by a situation. And we're hoping that the discussions that we've had over time, and especially with great reference to the Pope Francis's document, Fratelli Tutti, which talks about our common humanity, which is also reflected in the joint document signed by Pope Francis and Imam Sheikh Ahmed Taib of Al-Azhar in Cairo, which is today called the Abu Dhabi Declaration. All these are meant to call attention of the world to our solidarity, the fact that we all have to look out for one another, and in very special ways, this looking out for one another can also be achieved when we become more responsive, even in our own local situation, to the difficulties and challenges that people encounter. So I just want to use these words, or this my own contribution, to say thank you to the organizers of this conference. And I hope to join more and then probably be part of it. I was meant to understand that this was a 2-day conference that began yesterday and today. And I hope that I will join next time and make a more valuable contribution to the discussions ongoing. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Father Lawrence. And actually, your desire to be part of this is much welcome. As in our mind as organizers, we don't want this conversation to end here. We will continue engaging even online and to see what will come up, because we want to really build up a global community in solidarity with migrants, refugees, and displaced people. So we'd like to continue. We'll continue the conversation, and your part will be part of part of it. Of course, as Dr. Gerard's come to you, maybe we can see how we can enlarge the partnership in the future, in the near future. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I really want to thank Emra Elgen of Ufuk Dialogue Center, because he's been doing so much, a lot of work around here in Nigeria, and he's been a very veritable partner, himself and his team. They've really been very wonderful. And he's the one who I'm grateful to him for calling my attention to this conference and making me to join in. And I really want to use this opportunity to appreciate him and his team for the great work that they do around our country in Nigeria. Thank you very much. Thank you, Emra.
Thank you very much, Father. Thank you.
So, Emra, now it's your own remarks to this conference.
So first of all, I would like to say thanks for everybody, which is very beneficial about the vision, this program. Especially, I would like to say Mr. Burizan, especially because he's the one inviting us today as we are here. So I would like to also see him in Nigeria after 15 days. I hope he will enjoy in our conference, because we are going to organize the Law and Tolerance Conference, which is we are collaborating with the Minister of Foreign Affairs and different institutions. And also we are promoting the peace, mutual understanding, and coexistence. And also Father Lawrence is one of our partners from Catholic Secretariat and also Nigerian Supreme Council. So we are expecting more than 2,000 people in our conference, and we are going to organize 3 states. One is in Abuja, one is in Kaduna, one is in Lagos. So we would like to see him in our program. We are very glad to be here. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, and the work that you are doing in Nigeria in promoting the interfaith dialogue. Yeah. So this brings us to the end of our conference. I would like to introduce the organizers of this conference, because it has been done in partnership. Some are here with us online, and others may. So I would like first to acknowledge the Global Ministries University in California, Dr. Gerald and Marita, and together with Mary Akte. So they have a partnership with Tangaza University in Nairobi, and for the last 6 years, we've been organizing the conference on Fratelli Tutti, and this is our third edition. And each time we publish, so the second publication is on the way, and we will collect all the presentations and make a third publication. So, and this is based on the Abu Dhabi Declaration, the meeting between Pope Francis and the Grand Imam Sheikh Al-Tayeb of Al-Azhar University, and subsequently the publication of Fratelli Tutti on human fraternity and social friendship. Yeah. The second partner is Tangaza University, which is based in Nairobi, under the Institute for Interreligious Dialogue and Islamic Studies, where we train pastoral agents in Christian-Muslim dialogue specifically, but also dialogue in general. We have had quite a number of students, Don Lorenzo, sent from bishops from Nigeria to come to our program every year. We have 2 or 3 priests from Nigeria coming to our program. So fostering interreligious dialogue, especially Muslim-Christian dialogue. The third partner is the Harmony Institute of the Hizmet movement. We've been having collaboration in many ways, organizing interfaith dinners, organizing the scripture reasoning, and other meetings that really foster dialogue between various religions, not only Christian, Muslim, but all our meetings are interreligious meeting. And I would like to thank Yusuf, who has really played the technical part to make sure that the conference goes seamless, and we thank him for that. Then we have meet Yagros from the Intercultural Dialogue Forum from Frankfurt. Meet Yagros, can you just put on your camera? Yes, Mitiagros was running the European hub. So we are the Africa hub, the America hub, and a European hub. And thank you very much also for being part of this conversation, and we look forward collaborating together. Then we have Brother Rogers, who is working in the refugee settlement at the border between Uganda and Sudan. It is what is called one of the biggest vicariate for the refugees in Uganda. Rogers, your face, please, if you are on. Yeah. So thank you very much for organizing the panel, where it was a dialogue between a different way of approaching the issue of refugees and migrants between Malawi and Uganda. And then we have Hekima University College, but don't think that they are online today. So as our idea is that our conference does not end, we continue to engage online so that we see how we can put into practice some of the key highlights of this conference on belonging together, migrants, displaced people, and refugees in global solidarity. Once again, thank you very much. And I would like to request Yusuf to play again the video as he's sending us now forward with the key messages and highlights from the conference. Thank you very much for all the organizers. Technical problem. So thank you very much. Let us continue the connection and the conversation. Thank you very much. Okay, good. Yeah.